In 1918, in a weatherboard shed on the outskirts of Shepparton, Victoria, 150 women and 30 men showed up for the first day of work. They were peeling peaches and pears by hand, measuring cherries into fruit salad tins, stoning nectarines in the summer heat. They were not yet skilled in this. Nobody in Victoria was. This was the first day of operations at the first fruit cannery in the Goulburn Valley. There was no training manual. There was no template. There were fruit trees, there were tin cans, there were these workers, and there was a desperate need to preserve what would otherwise rot. By 1936, that weatherboard shed was gone, replaced by a factory that sprawled across 7 acres of germ-proof granolithic flooring. 400 women, neatly uniformed in blue, worked the lines. The Shepparton Advertiser described it that year with a headline that tells you everything. The British Empire's largest cannery, a vast Australian enterprise. By the 1970s, the factory was producing 43 million cans a year, not per decade, per year. The peaches and pears from the Goulburn Valley orchards, the tomatoes and baked beans and spaghetti that had widened the product range through 2 world wars were going into Australian kitchens and onto Australian tables across the entire country. SPC was not just a food company, it was the food bowl of Australia, turned into shelf-stable meals by the hands of workers who, in many cases, had parents and grandparents who worked the same lines. Then a global beverage company bought it for $750 million, and 14 years later sold it for $40 million. Here's what nobody tells you about this story. The company didn't fail because of mismanagement. It didn't fail because the product was bad. The SPC peaches on your supermarket shelf today are made from Australian fruit and are genuinely good. It failed because Australian fruit processors compete against Chinese imports that arrive in containers at prices that a Shepparton wages bill simply cannot match. And when SPC asked the federal government for $25 million, a one-time grant to modernize the factory and stay competitive, the same government that had promised $16 million to a foreign chocolate company before the election said no. No to an Australian cooperative that had been feeding the nation since 1918. No to the growers whose families had been in those orchards for 5 generations. No to the workers whose seasonal income had bought the washing machines and refrigerators and televisions of Shepparton families through decades when there was no other way to afford them. No, because the Prime Minister called it corporate welfare. He didn't call the Cadbury grant corporate welfare. Cadbury is British. This is not just the story of a tin of peaches. It is the story of what happens when a community builds something extraordinary and the forces they cannot control. A Chinese government that subsidizes its exporters, an Australian government that looks away, a global corporation that bought an icon and ran it into the ground, combined to take it apart. The fruit trees are still there. The orchards still blossom in the Goulburn Valley spring. But what was built around them has been transformed beyond recognition. Before we get into the full story, if you found this content valuable, please hit like and subscribe. Every subscriber helps this channel keep telling the Australian stories that deserve to be heard. Now let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Problem with Peaches. Victoria's Goulburn Valley, 1917. Here's the problem with a peach. A peach is perfect for about 4 days. From the moment it reaches peak ripeness, the moment when the flesh is soft and fragrant, and the juice runs down your chin. The clock is running. 3 days, 4 days, and it is mush. The skin breaks, the flesh browns, the sugar turns to fermentation. That window of perfection, the window you have to get it from the orchard to the person who will eat it, is brutally short. The Goulburn Valley in 1917 has orchards full of stone fruit, peaches, pears, nectarines, apricots. The irrigation infrastructure that the Victorian government has been developing since the 1880s. The channels that carry water from the Goulburn River to the flat plains of the district has made the valley one of the most productive fruit-growing regions in Australia. The climate is hot and reliable in summer. The soil with irrigation is productive. The orchards are mature. The fruit is excellent, and it rots. Not all of it, not necessarily. But the margin between a profitable harvest and a disaster is frighteningly thin. If the weather turns at the wrong moment, if transport is delayed, if the Melbourne market is already oversupplied, if anything at all interrupts the narrow window between ripe fruit and rotten fruit, the growers lose. They cannot control when the peaches ripen. They can only control what they do with them when they do. Before 1918, what they do is sell fresh fruit to whatever market they can reach within the window and lose the rest. The cannery in Shepparton will change that. The idea is straightforward. Build a facility that can process the fruit at the moment of peak ripeness, seal it in a tin, and make it available for sale anywhere in Australia throughout the entire year. A peach canned in February is still a peach in October. The tin eliminates the window. It takes the 4-day perishable and turns it into a product with a shelf life measured in years. The growers who formed the Shepparton Fruit Preserving Company in 1917 are not businessmen in the conventional sense. They are farmers who have looked at their situation and understood what they need. They are performing an act of collective self-preservation. If they do not build this cannery, their harvest is always hostage to conditions they cannot control. If they do build it, they control their own economic fate. The starting capital is £678, 19 shillings. Barely enough to build anything at all. Government funds are committed to supplement it. The facility is modest, a weatherboard shed. The equipment is basic. The knowledge base in Victoria of how to run an industrial canning operation is essentially zero. On January 31st, 1918, the manager makes the announcement. Canning will begin on the following Tuesday. The operation will require 150 girls or women and 30 men. In the wake of the First World War, the local paper hopes that the launch of this new industry will revive drooping energies and improve the economic circumstances of the region. It will do exactly that. But it will take years of struggle first. Chapter 2. The Man Who Saved It. Shepparton, 1920s. The first few years are hard. The 1918 season runs for only 7 weeks because of a late start, handling just 350 tons of fruit. The company struggles to make a profit. More government money has to be committed. The cooperative that the growers formed with such hope is, by the early 1920s, genuinely at risk of collapse before it has properly begun. Then a man named Andrew Fairley joins the board. Fairley is 37 years old. He is not a fruit grower. He is not a food processor. He is a businessman with rare gifts in finance and marketing who looks at this struggling cannery in a weatherboard shed and sees something that most people don't. He sees what SPC could be, not what it is, what it can become. He tells the board he will make the rescue and development of this business his life's work. And that is what he does. Within a few years, Fairley is appointed chairman and managing director. He drives the modernization of the factory, the expansion of the product range, the development of the marketing and distribution networks that will take SPC products from a regional novelty to a national staple. He shows particular concern for the workers, not as a performance or a policy, but as a genuine human instinct. When he eventually dies, he will have left many of his workers' personal legacies in his will. the managing director who left his employees money when he died. This was who was running SPC in its formative years. By 1925, a record quantity of fruit is exported to London. By 1929, all government loans and interest have been repaid. The cooperative is paying annual bonuses to its grower shareholders. The weatherboard shed is being replaced by real factory infrastructure. And the community is beginning to organize itself around the rhythms of the cannery. This is what a food processor does for a region that nobody who has not lived it can fully understand. The seasons become the pulse of the town. Summer is when the stone fruit comes in. The peaches and pears and nectarines from the Goulburn Valley orchards. When the fruit is ready, the cannery needs workers. Hundreds of them, thousands of them. Women from Shepparton and the surrounding towns who work the lines through the summer heat, cutting and stoning and sorting and canning, earning the seasonal income that, for families of limited means in the post-war decades, makes the difference between just surviving and actually getting ahead. One woman, who grew up in a family of 7 in the district, recalls exactly what her mother's seasonal income from the cannery meant. Not luxuries, necessities that hadn't been within reach before: a washing machine, a refrigerator, a television, a car. These things that the rest of Australia was acquiring through the post-war economic boom. In the Goulburn Valley, they were acquired because the cannery had a season, and the season had work, and the work paid wages that the families could save. SPC was massive. In our family, as one worker would later recall, with my father-in-law and mother-in-law permanent and myself seasonal, all working there 40+ years each. 40 years each. 3 people in one family. 120 combined years of working life, given to a factory that had been built by the growers of the district to preserve their fruit and their livelihoods. The cannery as community institution. The cannery as economic anchor. The cannery as the thing that made Shepparton what it was. Andrew Fairley understood this. He understood that SPC was not merely a food company. It was the mechanism by which the Goulburn Valley sustained itself. When he was knighted in 1951, Sir Andrew Fairley was recognized as one of the world's leading experts in fruit, canning, and a major figure in Australian primary industry. He had turned a weatherboard shed into the largest fruit canning complex in the Southern Hemisphere. He became the first mayor of Shepparton. A gallery space in the Shepparton Art Museum was named after him. He died at 81, still serving as the company's leader. He had no children. His estate went into the Fairley Foundation to assist the people of Shepparton and the Goulburn Valley. Even in death, he gave back to the community he had served. Chapter 3. The Factory That Fed the Empire. Shepparton, 1930s to 1970s. By 1936, the Shepparton Advertiser is not describing the SPC factory as a modest regional operation. The headline says, "What needs to be said. The British Empire's largest cannery. A vast Australian enterprise." Let that sit for a moment. Not the largest in Victoria, not the largest in Australia, the largest in the British Empire. In 1936, that means something. The British Empire encompasses Australia, Canada, India, South Africa, New Zealand, and dozens of territories across every inhabited continent. And the largest fruit cannery in the entire apparatus is in Shepparton, Victoria, built by a cooperative of fruit growers who started with £678 in capital. The factory by this point is extraordinary. 7 acres of floor space, paved with granolithic surfacing designed to be germ-proof. Sawtooth roofs specifically engineered to allow maximum natural light. 400 women in blue uniforms working the lines. At dawn peak season, nearly 700 workers passing through the gates every day. The machinery sorts fruit by size, with an accuracy that astonishes visitors. An ingenious apparatus that grades and drafts the fruit automatically. Only the highest quality fruit is allowed to pass into the works. The cannery sets a standard which is not equalled by any other processing plant in Australia. The Shepparton Advertiser notes, "Whatever the standard maintained by other canneries, SPC is not influenced in enforcing rigid maintenance of the high level of excellence established. It is producing 12 million cans a year in 1936, 12 million cans of Australian fruit, grown in the Goulburn Valley, preserved at the moment of peak ripeness, distributed across the entire country, and exported to Britain." The Second World War transforms the factory again. The product range expands to include additional fruits, jam, baked beans, and tinned spaghetti. The wartime demand for preserved food is voracious. When soldiers are in the field and supply lines are strained, canned food is the difference between eating and not eating. SPC feeds the military as well as the civilian population. The factory runs longer hours. The workers work harder. The output climbs. The post-war decades are SPC's golden age. Australia is growing. The population is expanding through immigration and the baby boom. The suburban kitchens of Australia's post-war prosperity need to be stocked. And stocking them means canned fruit, canned vegetables, canned baked beans, canned spaghetti, all made in Shepparton by workers who in many cases have grown up in Shepparton. By the 1970s, SPC is producing 43 million cans a year. 43 million cans. Every one of them containing Australian fruit or vegetables, grown in the valley, processed in the factory, distributed through a national retail network to kitchens across the continent. Meanwhile, down the road in Murarupna, the Ardmona Cannery, also a cooperative, also founded by Goulburn Valley fruit growers, is running its own operation and doing its own innovating. Ardmona becomes the first processor in the world to pack fruit in natural juice, responding to the growing consumer preference for less sugar. This is not a trivial innovation. It is a global first that other major manufacturers around the world soon follow. Ardmona also becomes the first to pack fruit in long-life plastic tubs, another world first. The Goulburn Valley fruit processors are not passive operations watching the rest of the world lead. They are leading. This is what the Valley has built through 60 years of work. The largest fruit cannery complex in the Southern Hemisphere. A global innovation leader. The economic anchor of a regional community. The thing that made Shepparton Shepparton. Chapter 4. The dark side of the production line. Shepparton across the decades. Here is what the factory looked like from the inside. The summer heat in the Goulburn Valley is real. Not mild. Not Mediterranean. Australian summer heat. The kind that sits in the 30s day after day. That builds up in enclosed spaces and does not dissipate. And inside the cannery, in the summer when the stone fruit comes in, and the production lines run at full capacity, you are standing on your feet for 10 hours in that heat processing fruit. The pear line is particular. Those who worked it in the later years still recall the smell of overripe pears from 4 decades later. The smell of overripe pears still makes me gag, as one former worker said, almost 40 years later. The cutting and stoning of fruit, which in the early years was entirely by hand, women with tools shaped specifically for the task, hands moving with the repetitive precision of industrial work, is the kind of labor that leaves its mark. Hours on your feet. The same motion, thousands of times. The same smell every day of the season. The quality control work carries its own disillusionment. You check samples. You weigh and empty tins. You find what you find. A large moth in one, a nail in another. The pie pack into which the borderline fruit goes when the 4 ladies inspect the reject buckets is not something you buy again once you know how the pie pack is assembled. The night shift is its own experience. Women who did night shift in the 70s described the split sleep hours, the particular disorientation of working while the rest of the world sleeps, the way the shift structure reorganizes family life around the factory's needs. And yet, when these same workers describe their time at the cannery, decades later in the forums and letters and oral histories that the Shepparton community has produced, the dominant register is not complaint, it is warmth. Those days were just the very best. Wonderful times for locals to make extra money. Great memories. My wife did night shift in the 70s, which helped us give the kids a good holiday. When our son grew up, he worked night shift for a few years and learned every aspect of all the lines. Son followed mother, father-in-law, followed by son-in-law. The cannery as the institution into which families inserted successive generations, each one learning the specific knowledge of the lines, the specific smell of each product, the specific community that formed among people who worked together in the heat for months at a time. This community is what the economists do not model when they calculate the economic impact of a cannery closure. They can calculate the wages foregone, they can calculate the supply chain effects and the tax revenue lost. They cannot calculate what it means to a family, that the thing their parents did, the thing that bought the first television and the first car, the thing that their children also did in the school holidays, is gone. When SPC needed defending in 2014, Australians who had never set foot in Shepparton went to the supermarket and bought SPC products in volumes that surprised the company itself. They were not buying tinned peaches. They were buying a memory, a grandmother's kitchen, a Christmas pudding, a childhood summer holiday with ice cream and canned peaches on a Queensland afternoon. These were Australians defending something that had made them who they were. You cannot put a price on that. The spreadsheets do not have a row for it. But it is real. And when it is gone, it does not come back. Chapter 5. The merger and the acquisition Goulburn Valley and Sydney, 2002 to 2005. By the late 1990s, the competitive landscape for Australian fruit processors is deteriorating. Not quickly. Not with dramatic warning signs that trigger obvious responses. Deteriorating in the way that structural problems deteriorate. Steadily, persistently, in ways that any single year's data can be explained away. But the trend cannot. The Australian dollar is high by historical standards, making exports expensive. Cheap imports from Asia are beginning to find their way onto Australian supermarket shelves. The cost of operating a large industrial facility in regional Victoria, with Australian wages, Australian energy prices, Australian environmental compliance, is rising relative to the cost of operating in countries that have none of those constraints. SPC and Ardmona, the two great cooperatives of the Goulburn Valley fruit industry, have been rivals for 80 years. Different boards, different shareholders, different management cultures, different brands. But by 2002, the logic of their combination is undeniable. Together they command the Australian market. Together they can achieve economies of scale that neither can reach alone. Together they can present a united front to the supermarkets that have the pricing power to make or break any food processor. They merge in 2002. SPC Ardmona. The combined entity is the largest producer of packaged fruit and vegetables in Australia. The Goulburn Valley is now home to a single major fruit processing operation rather than two competing ones. The efficiency gains are real, the market position is formidable. Then, in 2004, SPC Ardmona acquires Henry Jones' postwar XL, one of Australia's most iconic food brands, established in 1859. IXL Jams. Taylor's Sauces. The portfolio is growing, the brand is growing, the business looks, from the outside, like exactly the kind of vertically integrated Australian food company that should attract long-term investment. It attracts a $750 million acquisition. In 2005, Coca-Cola Amatil buys SPC Ardmona for $750 million. CCA also invests approximately $250 million in infrastructure. Total commitment, $1 billion. The CCA rationale makes sense on paper. The beverage giant concede that consumers are moving toward healthier food options. SPC has number 1 or number 2 market positions in its key categories. The Goulburn Valley brand equity is genuine. The infrastructure is there. The distribution network is there. The workforce is there. What CCA perhaps does not fully account for is the specific vulnerability of the Australian food processing industry to a combination of forces that will hit simultaneously in the decade ahead. High dollar, Chinese imports, supermarket private label power, the squeeze from multiple directions that no single strategic response can fully address. In 2013, SPC Ardmona loses $25 million. 8 years earlier, it made a $70 million profit, a $95 million swing. Not cyclical, structural. Something fundamental has broken. Chapter 6. The Dragon and the Dollar, Australia and China. 2001 to 2013. Here is the number that explains the crisis more clearly than any other. In 2001, Australia imported 3,000 tons of packaged Chinese fruit. 3,000 tons. In 2011, that number is 27,000 tons. In a single decade, Chinese packaged fruit imports to Australia have grown by 9 times. Now here is the comparison that lands it. In 2012, SPC Ardmona sells just over 36,000 tons of packaged fruit in Australia. Its entire Australian sales volume is 36,000 tons, and Chinese imports are 27,000 tons. Chinese canned fruit has grown in 1 decade to volumes nearly equal to SPC's entire Australian sales. And the Chinese fruit is not arriving at market prices. Chinese fruit processors are supported by government subsidies. They operate in a manufacturing environment with labour costs that are a fraction of Shepparton's. They are selling into the Australian market at prices that the Shepparton factory literally cannot match without losing money on every can. The Australian dollar doesn't help. A high dollar makes every Australian product more expensive relative to imports. When the dollar was lower, Australian exporters could compete. When the dollar rises, as it did dramatically through the mining boom years, Australian manufacturers selling domestically face cheaper imported competition, and Australian exporters face markets that have become uncompetitive overnight. These 2 forces, Chinese subsidized imports and the high dollar, hit SPC simultaneously in the years after the CCA acquisition. Neither is SPC's fault. Neither is CCA's fault. They are structural forces operating at a global scale that a regional Victorian cannery has no mechanism to neutralize on its own. The SPC factory at Shepparton is not inefficient. It has been modernized. It has been updated with CCA's $250 million in infrastructure investment. It produces fruit of quality that its export customers in Asia and Europe recognize as superior to the Chinese alternative. The service call rate analogy that would apply to a factory like Orange's fridge facility. The quality metrics are excellent. The factory is doing everything right in technical terms. But a competitor selling the same product for half the price, backed by government subsidies, in a market with no countervailing protection is not a problem that technical excellence solves. It is a problem that policy needs to address, and Australia's policy in 2014 will be to say no. Chapter 7. The $25 million question, Canberra, January 2014. In October 2013, SPC Ardmona approaches both the federal and Victorian governments. The request is specific. $50 million combined, $25 million federal, $25 million state, as a one-time grant to modernize the Shepparton factory. In return, CCA commits a further $90 million to $100 million in private investment. The total package would be $140 million to $150 million of modernization investment. 350 jobs secured. The factory competitive into the future. This is not a request for ongoing subsidization. It is not a request for the government to take over the business. It is a request for a one-time injection to allow a factory that is profitable, that is good at what it does, to invest in the modernization that will let it continue competing against rivals who are backed by foreign government subsidies. The Victorian government's industry and agriculture ministers support the bid. The federal government's own industry ministers' advisory panel supports the business case. The mathematics are unambiguous. The $25 million federal grant, which would unlock the same from Victoria, and the $90 million plus from CCA, is cheaper than the alternative. If SPC closes, the unemployment cost alone in the first year from half the workers failing to find employment would exceed the grant. The regional economy hit, estimated at $650 million, would be catastrophic for one of the 10 most disadvantaged areas in Australia. But the decision is not made in the Goulburn Valley. It is not made by the people who understand the factory or the region. It is made in Federal Cabinet in Canberra. And on the 30th of January 2014, after a 3-hour discussion, Federal Cabinet rejects the SPC request. Prime Minister Tony Abbott explains his reasoning. CCA is a profitable company. Taxpayer funds should not subsidise the ordinary operations of a profitable multinational. The SPC workers have an enterprise bargaining agreement that includes, and Abbott makes this point specifically, 9 weeks of paid leave including public holidays and rostered days off. The company needs to reform itself before seeking government help. 9 weeks of leave. Abbott uses the workers' entitlements as the reason to deny their employer the assistance that might have saved their jobs. The workers had negotiated those entitlements through the industrial relations system. They had given other concessions to get them, and now those entitlements were being used as the moral justification for walking away. The audacity of this is breathtaking. It is not the workers' entitlements that are competing with Chinese imports. It is not the workers' annual leave that makes subsidized Chinese canned peaches cheaper than Australian ones. These are structural economic forces operating at a global scale. And the response from the Prime Minister is to tell the workers their leave conditions are the problem. Meanwhile, the same Prime Minister has promised $16 million to Cadbury before the election. Cadbury, which is owned by Mondelez International, a global corporation headquartered in Chicago. The $16 million was described as investment in regional tourism infrastructure, in a seat that the coalition needed to hold. The Cadbury grant had no formal business case when it was promised. The government's own opposition exposed this through a Freedom of Information request. Cadbury eventually withdrew the application when it couldn't meet the export volume conditions. Are workers in Tasmania more important than workers in Victoria? A journalist asked Abbott at the press conference. No, absolutely not, Abbott says, but the outcome suggests otherwise. Chapter 8. The Can Fights Back Australia, February to March 2014. Something unexpected happens in the weeks after the federal government's rejection. Australians buy SPC products. Not just the people of Shepparton, not just the people of the Goulburn Valley who have personal connections to the factory. Australians across the country, in Sydney supermarkets, Melbourne grocers, Brisbane supermarkets, Perth Coles, start reaching past the cheaper alternatives and choosing the SPC can. They post on social media. They share why they are doing it. They tell each other. The #BuySPC movement is spontaneous, organic, and commercially significant. The Woolworths-branded peach and pear sales from SPC increased by 60% in 2014. 60%. Driven not by price competitiveness or an advertising campaign, but by an emotion. Australians who believe that what SPC represents, Australian growers, Australian workers, Australian food, is worth paying extra for. SPC's managing director has the grace to acknowledge the irony. It was probably the best $25 million we never got, he says, because it raised with consumers everywhere the issues that SPC is facing. He is right about A, the public consciousness. He is wrong about the outcome. Because the consumer response, powerful as it is emotionally, cannot solve the structural economics of competing against subsidized Chinese imports. Consumers can boost sales by 20 or 30%. They cannot eliminate a cost differential that makes every can made in Shepparton more expensive to produce than every can made in a Chinese factory, with government backing and wages at a fraction of Australian rates. The Victorian government steps in with $22 million as part of a broader co-investment deal. The factory stays open. The jobs are preserved for the time being. The immediate crisis passes, but the structural problem is still there, still eroding, still working through the numbers. In November 2016, Woolworths ends its contract with SPC Ardmona for the supply of tinned tomatoes. The supermarket that had ridden to the rescue with its 60% sales increase 3 years earlier walks away from part of the deal when it no longer serves its purposes. The supermarket that plays the patriotic card when it helps sales can just as easily walk away when the economics of the private label alternative look better. Chapter 9. 1 billion to 40 million. Sydney and Shepparton, 2005 to 2019. In June 2019, Coca-Cola Amatil announces the sale of SPC to a group called Shepparton Partners Collective. The price is $40 million. Let the arithmetic of this sit for a moment. CCA paid $750 million to buy SPC Ardmona in 2005. CCA invested a further $250 million in infrastructure over the following years. The Victorian government provided $22 million in co-investment. Total capital committed to the SPC Shepparton operation, more than $1 billion. 14 years later, after presiding over the loss of grower contracts, after the near-closure crisis of 2014, after the federal government's rejection, after the Woolworths tomato contract cancellation, after years of declining market share against subsidized Chinese imports, after a $95 million swing from $70 million profit to $25 million loss, $40 million, $1 billion of investment and corporate ownership reduced to $40 million. The cooperative that fruit growers formed in 1917 to protect their harvest, that Andrew Fairley turned into the largest fruit canning complex in the Southern Hemisphere, that employed generations of Shepparton families in seasonal and permanent work across a century, passed through the hands of a global beverage corporation and emerged from the other side as a private equity asset at a valuation 96% below the acquisition price. Shepparton Partners Collective is a joint venture between two private equity firms. The decisions that will affect the lives of the growers and workers of the Goulburn Valley are made by people whose relationship with the valley is financial, not generational, not personal, not built across the decades of sitting on the same board as the same farmers and watching the same orchards blossom and fruit. Financial. The factory still runs. SPC still cans fruit in Shepparton. The company is still alive. In 2020 to 21, it makes a profit of $11.8 million. In 2021 to 22, the profit grows to $24 million. Under new ownership, the business stabilizes. New product categories are developed. The brand is rebuilt. In December 2024, SPC Global relists on the ASX. This is genuinely positive. The factory's survival matters. The growers still have a buyer. The workers still have jobs. The brand that Australians trust is still on the shelf. But what was built has been fundamentally transformed. The cooperative of fruit growers that governed this enterprise for 80 years, that paid its members bonuses from profits and gave them a direct stake in the outcome of their own harvest, is gone. In its place is a corporate ownership structure that sees the Goulburn Valley as an investment portfolio rather than a community. The fruit trees are still there. The factory is still there. The brand is still there. But the growers who founded it would not recognize what governs it. Chapter 10. The Lessons from the Valley. What can we learn from the story of SPC? Because this is not just a story about tinned fruit. It is a story about what Australia is willing to fight for, about what happens when a government decides which industries deserve protection and which ones don't, about the gap between the rhetoric of buying Australian and the reality of policy decisions that make buying Australian impossible. Lesson 1. A community is not an abstraction, and its loss is not an abstraction either. When the federal government rejected SPC's $25 million request in 2014, the analysis was purely financial. CCA is profitable. The grant is corporate welfare. The EBA is too generous. The calculation was done on a spreadsheet. What didn't appear on the spreadsheet? The mother of 5 in the 1950s, whose seasonal cannery income bought the family's first washing machine. The father-in-law and mother-in-law, who gave 40 years each to the permanent workforce. The son who followed his mother onto the night shift and learned every aspect of every line. The primary school in Dookie, where the outdoor play equipment featured a giant wooden SPC fruit crate. The school excursion to the cannery that every Goulburn Valley kid went on. These are not sentimentalities. They are the actual substance of what a community-anchored industry does over 100 years. It creates identity. It creates economic security. It creates the specific form of pride that comes from knowing that what you do matters. That the peaches you grow and can are in kitchens across the country. When you close that, you do not close a factory. You close a world. Lesson 2. Selective intervention is not a principle. It is a preference. The Abbott government argued that supporting SPC was corporate welfare and contrary to free market principles. This argument would be more convincing if those principles were applied consistently. The same government promised $16 million to Cadbury, owned by Mondelez International, headquartered in Chicago, before the election. The same government spent $10 billion annually in industry assistance across the broader economy, according to the Productivity Commission's estimates in the same year. The same government provided $3.5 million to Huon Aquaculture in Tasmania, also in a marginal seat, within days of rejecting SPC. Free market principles, applied selectively, are not free market principles. They are political choices dressed in economic language. The SPC cannery served Shepparton, which is one of the 10 most disadvantaged regions in Australia. It served growers whose families had been in those orchards for 5 generations. It faced not the natural dynamics of a free market, but the specific distortion of a Chinese government that subsidizes its food processors, and a trading system that allows those subsidized goods to flood the Australian market at prices no unsubsidized Australian producer can match. In that context, the government's decision to maintain free market purity at the expense of Shepparton's economic anchor, while simultaneously subsidizing a Tasmanian chocolate factory, is not principle. It is politics. Lesson 3. The cooperative model protects communities. The corporate model serves shareholders. For 80 years, SPC was a cooperative. Its shareholders were the growers who supplied it. Its success was directly their success. When SPC made a profit, the growers received bonuses. When SPC needed investment, the growers and the community provided it. The people who governed the business were the people who lived in the community the business served. This alignment of interest produced something extraordinary. A factory that grew from a weatherboard shed to the largest fruit cannery in the British Empire. A business that paid its workers fairly enough that they stayed for 40 years and brought their children. A community institution so embedded in regional identity that a kinder playground in Dookie had an SPC fruit crate as play equipment. The corporate model serves different interests. CCA bought SPC because the numbers looked attractive in 2005. When the numbers stopped looking attractive, CCA sold it for 96% less than it paid. The people who made that decision lived nowhere near Shepparton. They attended no board meetings in the valley. They did not know the growers whose contracts were cancelled or the workers who lost permanent positions. They executed a portfolio management decision and moved on. This is not a criticism of CCA as a company. It is an observation about the structural difference between an ownership model built around community interest and one built around shareholder return. When those interests align, the corporate model can work well. When they diverge, when the community's interest in the Wadul factory's continuation conflicts with the shareholders' interest in exiting a declining investment, the community loses. It always does. Lesson 4. You cannot buy Australian if Australian isn't on the shelf. Australians showed in 2014 that they were willing to pay more for SPC products when they understood what was at stake. 60% sales growth, driven by sentiment and solidarity. That is a real economic force. But consumer patriotism cannot substitute for policy. A consumer choosing the SPC peach over the cheaper Chinese alternative is making a personal statement. Millions of consumers making the same statement produces a meaningful sales increase. But it does not make SPC's cost structure competitive with a Chinese processor backed by government subsidy. It does not change the exchange rate. It does not change the fundamental economics of producing food in Australia versus producing it in Southeast Asia. Policy changes economics. Consumer choices express values. Both matter. But one works at a scale the other cannot reach. Australia has, over the past 3 decades, systematically reduced the policy tools available to protect domestic food processing from subsidized foreign competition, through tariff reductions, through the rejection of industry assistance requests, through the acceptance of trade agreements that give foreign food processors access to the Australian market without equivalent obligations of fairness in their own markets. The result is visible in the Goulburn Valley. SPC is the last major Australian fruit processor. 20+ competitors that once operated across Australia have closed or moved production offshore. Heinz closed its Goulburn Valley cannery in 2012. Windsor Farm closed in Cowra. An entire Australian food processing industry has been hollowed out simultaneously. You cannot buy Australian if Australian isn't made here anymore. And it is not made here because the policy settings that would have allowed Australian food processors to compete against subsidised foreign competition were not put in place. The can on the shelf that says SPC is Australian fruit, processed in Australia, is the last of its kind. The question is whether it will remain that way, or whether the next generation will open a supermarket shelf and find only the Chinese alternative at the price that makes the question moot. The fruit trees and what remains. Drive through the Goulburn Valley in spring, and the orchards are still there. The peach and pear trees in blossom are as magnificent as they have ever been. The irrigation channels that the Victorian government built in the 1880s still carry water to the flat plains. The fruit still ripens in summer in the specific quality that makes Goulburn Valley stone fruit something worth fighting to preserve. The factory still runs. SPC Global, as it is now called, processes Australian fruit in Shepparton. The growers who still hold contracts, around 130 of them, still deliver fruit to the cannery at the peak of the season. The lines still run, the cans still fill, but something has changed. Not the fruit, not the factory. The relationship between the factory and the community that built it. In 1918, a group of fruit growers formed a cooperative to protect their harvest. The people who owned the company were the people who grew the fruit. The people who governed it were the people who lived in it. The people who worked it were the people whose families built their lives around it. In 2024, SPC Global is listed on the Australian Securities Exchange, owned by shareholders whose relationship with the Goulburn Valley is entirely mediated by a stock price. The decisions that affect the lives of the growers and workers of Shepparton are made in boardrooms whose members may never have visited the orchard rows or the factory floor. The growers' children are still in those orchards. Some of those families have been supplying the cannery for 5 generations. A century of continuous relationship between a piece of land, a fruit tree, a family, and a factory. That relationship is still there. But the cooperative that made the relationship reciprocal, that guaranteed the growers a stake in the outcome of their own harvest, is gone. What replaced it is a private equity holding structure that sees the Goulburn Valley as an asset class. Andrew Fairley joined the board of a struggling weatherboard cannery in the 1920s and said he would make its rescue and development his life's work. He was true to his word. When he died, he left his workers money in his will. Nobody who owns SPC today will leave the workers of Shepparton money in their will. This is not a moral failure. It is a structural reality. The cooperative produces one kind of relationship between an enterprise and a community. The corporate model produces another. The Australian family that opens a can of SPC peaches today is still getting Australian fruit. They are still getting quality. They are still supporting jobs in the Goulburn Valley. But they are no longer buying from a company that was founded by the people it serves. They are buying from a private equity asset that happens to still be making Australian food. The fruit growers who formed the Shepparton Fruit Preserving Company in 1917 did not want to become an asset class. They wanted to ensure their harvest wouldn't rot. They wanted economic security for their families. They wanted to build something in the valley that would outlast them. They built it. It has outlasted them. But the thing that outlasted them is not quite the thing they built. The fruit trees are still there, the orchards still blossom, the factory still runs. But the cooperative is gone, and the city government that rejected the $25 million that might have kept it competitive and the beverage giant that bought it for $1 billion and sold it for $40 million are not remembered in Shepparton the way Andrew Fairley is remembered. They don't have foundations named after them. They don't have gallery spaces. They don't have streets. What they have is a decision made in Canberra in January 2014 and a sale completed in Sydney in June 2019, and a community still living with both of those choices. The can on the shelf says SPC. It says Australian fruit. It says Goulburn Valley. Pick it up. Buy it. Not because it's cheap. It isn't. Not because you can't find an alternative. You can. But because a group of fruit growers in 1917 decided that their harvest was worth preserving, that their community was worth building, that Australian food made in Australia by Australian workers from Australian orchards was worth the effort. They were right then. The question is whether Australia still believes they were right now.